This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. The story you're about to hear belongs to one of mythology's most enduring figures, Fionn mac Cumhaill, hero of ancient Ireland. Across 5 chapters, we'll follow him from a hunted childhood in the forests of Slieve Bladna, through the riverbank moment that gave him the wisdom of the world, to the night he saved Tara itself. We'll witness a love story that shook the Fianna to its foundations, and meet the giant who, if you believe the stones of Antrim, once dressed as a baby to outwit a Scotsman. This is a myth still alive in the land that made it.
Chapter 1. Born from Loss and Secrecy. There is something deeply human about the need to give greatness an origin story. We want to know where the extraordinary came from, what wounds it carried, what it had to survive before it could become legend. In Irish mythology, few origin stories are as rich, as politically charged, or as quietly devastating as that of Fionn mac Cumhaill. Before he was the wise leader of Ireland's greatest warrior band, before he earned a name that meant bright and fair, he was a hunted child with a dead father, a mother who could not keep him, and a name no one was allowed to know.
The story begins not with Fionn himself, but with his father, Cumhaill, the leader of the Fianna. Cumhaill and the bloodline that would produce Fionn stemmed from Leinster, rooted in the tribe of Uí a regional origin that grounded their claim to power in specific territory and specific kinship rather than abstract prestige. The Fianna were not simply an army. They were something more complex and more interesting than that. A roving band of free-born young men, mostly from the nobility of Ireland, who had left behind the settled life of their clans but had not yet inherited the land that would make them full members of society. They were warriors, yes, but also hunters, poets, and storytellers. During the winter months, local lords and kings housed and fed them in exchange for their service as peacekeepers. During the summer, they lived entirely off the land. Cumhaill, as leader of the Clan Baskna branch of the Fianna, was one of the most powerful men in Ireland, serving under Conn of the 100 Battles, a king whose stronghold stood at Kennanos, the place now known as Kells in County Meath. Whether Conn held authority over all of Ireland or functioned primarily as a powerful regional ruler is a question the old sources answer differently. But his power was real and his judgment was final in the world that surrounded Cumhaill.
Cumhaill's downfall did not come from an enemy in battle or a rival warrior. It came from love. He pursued the hand of a woman named Muireann Menchaim, whose name in the Irish language means of the fair neck or of the lovely neck. She was the daughter of a powerful druid named Taj mac Nuadat, who lived on the hill of Almu. One tradition gives Muireann still older and stranger blood. The Acalamna Senarach describes her as a granddaughter of Nuada of the Tuatha De Danann, placing supernatural ancestry in her lineage alongside her father's druidic power. Whatever the precise shape of her heritage, Taj refused every man who sought to marry her. The reason given in the oldest sources is stark and prophetic. He had foreseen that if his daughter were to marry, he would lose his ancestral seat. Whether Cumhaill dismissed this prophecy or simply refused to be denied, the outcome was the same. When Taj refused his request, Cumhaill abducted Muireann and the two fled together. This single act detonated a political crisis. Taj went directly to Conn, demanding justice. Conn declared Cumhaill an outlaw. The two sides met at the Battle of Cunhaill, a location near the present-day area of Castleknock, on the outskirts of modern Dublin. Cumhall's forces were outnumbered. He fought and he was killed. The man who killed him was Gull mac Morna, the leader of the rival Clan Morna faction of the Fianna. With that single act, Gull stepped into the role that Cumhaill had occupied, taking command of the Fianna himself, a position he would hold for 10 years.
What makes this opening so striking is the layers of injustice it contains. Cumhaill was outlawed not for an act of cruelty or treachery, but for the stubborn refusal to accept that a druid's prophecy should override his own desires. Whether you find him romantic or reckless, he died for it, and the consequences fell on everyone around him. Myrna, by the time of the battle, was already pregnant with Cumhall's child. She returned to her father's household, but Tag, whose prophecy had now come true in the worst possible way, rejected her entirely. According to the oldest accounts, he ordered his people to burn her. It was Conn himself who intervened, refusing to allow this, and placing Myrna under the protection of a man named Fiacol mac Conchin. Fiacol's wife was a druidess named Bodmal, and she was Cumhall's own sister, which means the unborn child Myrna was carrying would be placed directly into the hands of his father's kin. In Fiacol's house, Myrna gave birth to a boy. She named him Dimne. The name is worth pausing on. In Old Irish, it carries a meaning of sureness or certainty, but it is also the word for a young male deer, a creature that is swift, sensitive, and always alert to danger. This double meaning is not coincidence. Celtic myth rarely wastes a name. The boy born as Dimna would spend his earliest years as a creature of the wild, hunted and fleet-footed, knowing that discovery meant death.
Myrna did not stay. The accounts differ on the details, but agree on the essential cruelty of the situation. She left her son in the care of Buldmal and a second woman, a skilled warrior known as Liath Luachra, which translates as Grey of Luachra. These two women took the boy deep into the forest of Slieve Bladma and raised him in secret. Myrne is said to have seen him only once more, when he was 6 years old. For all the weight that Irish mythology places on the bonds of family and lineage, the birth of its greatest hero is a story of a mother compelled to give her child away so that he might survive. Think about what this means. Fionn grew up without a father, without his mother, knowing that men were hunting him who would kill him if they found him, and not only him. The sources note that his brother Tulcha mac Cumhaill was hunted alongside him. 2 sons of the same dead man pursued by Gull and the sons of Clan Morna through the years of their childhood. His name itself was a secret. His very existence was politically dangerous. And yet the 2 women who raised him gave him everything they had. Bothmal was a druidess, a bandroi, who taught him the arts of her practice and the deep knowledge of the natural world. Liath Luachra was a skilled warrior who trained him in combat and hunting. What is genuinely remarkable about this arrangement is what it reveals about Fionn's education when you hold it against the institutions of early Irish society. The culture would normally have divided this formation across entirely separate male establishments, the warriors' hall on one side, the druid school on the other. Fionn received both simultaneously, in a forest, from women who held no official standing in either tradition. The forest was his first education, and it was more complete than anything a conventional childhood could have offered.
The early accounts describe him as a shapely, fair youth, striking in appearance even as a boy. But the physical detail that mythology chose to preserve about him is the one that gave him his permanent name. At some point before adulthood, his hair turned prematurely white. In a culture where the word for white hair, for brightness, for moral fairness, and for noble character could all be captured in the single Old Irish adjective Finn, this was not just a physical curiosity. It was a signal. When he eventually ventured out of the forest and found a group of youths playing hurling on a field, a game he dominated completely, beating all the other players single-handedly, it was the chieftain's son watching, jealous of the stranger's skill, who first called him Finn. That same jealousy turned the other boys against him, driving him from the field. But the name had found him. Demne faded away. He became Fionn.
There is something quietly extraordinary about a hero who earns his name not from a great deed in battle, not from killing a monster or surviving a ritual trial, but simply because his hair turned white while he was still a boy. It suggests that the ancient Irish tradition recognized something in Fionn from the very beginning, that his brightness was not something he had to achieve. It was something he had to survive long enough to reveal. After the hurling incident, his foster mothers knew their time in Slia Bladma was coming to an end. Word would spread. They sent Fionn out into the wider world of Ireland alone.
What followed was a period of wandering that reads like a young man testing the edges of the world that had been shaped before he arrived. Fionn traveled under false names, entering the service of various local kings across Ireland. Each time, the same thing happened. The king would recognize something in him, his bearing perhaps, or some feature that recalled Cumhaill, and send him away. Not with cruelty, but with genuine regret and genuine fear. The kingdom that sheltered Cumhall's son would invite the wrath of Clan Morna. No king was willing to take that risk. So Fionn moved on, and moved on again. He was a prince without a kingdom, a warrior without a lord, a young man whose father's death had made the entire political structure of Ireland hostile to his very presence. One account mentions that the king of Bantry recognized him the moment he arrived and told him plainly, "Leave, for I cannot protect you." This kind of origin carries something important for understanding what Fionn later became. Scholars of comparative folklore have classified tales of his childhood under ATU 369, the youth on a quest for his lost father, a story type distributed across many cultures, each version shaped by what that culture most wants to examine through the figure of a hunted heir. Every tradition produces hidden princes, but the specific shape of their ordeal tells you what that culture values and what kinds of suffering it expects its greatest figures to have survived. The Greek hero Achilles was raised by a wise centaur and trained in medicine and music before warfare. The Norse hero Sigurd grew up under the shadow of a cursed inheritance. King Arthur was a hidden prince raised in obscurity, denied his own identity until the moment arrived to claim it. Fionn belongs in that company, but what makes his origin unusual, even within that tradition, is the emphasis on the wisdom of the women who sheltered him over the heroics of any male protector. He is not forged in a great battle or shaped by a legendary male mentor. He is hidden in a forest, raised by a druidess and a female warrior simultaneously, denied his name and his lineage, and sent out into the world with no sword and no king at his back. His first inheritance is not power, it is knowledge, and it arrived through people who operated entirely outside the institutions officially responsible for producing it. There is also a grief that runs beneath this entire story, rarely named but always present. Cumhaill was killed. Mjorna lost everything. Bodmal raised her brother's son in hiding. And Fionn himself, as he wandered from kingdom to kingdom, always recognized, always turned away, carried something that had no outlet yet. His father's death was not an ancient wrong in a distant age. It was recent. It was personal. Gol Mac Morna, the man responsible, was still alive, still powerful, and still holding the position that should have passed to Cumhall's bloodline. What Fionn would eventually do with that grief, and with Tag, and with Gol himself, belongs to a later chapter. Before any of that was possible, before he could stand in front of kings and demand what was owed to his father's memory, he needed something that no amount of forest training, no sword technique, no knowledge of the druidic arts could give him on its own. He needed wisdom of a different order entirely. And to find it, he would have to travel east, to the banks of the River Boyne. Chapter 2, The Burned Thumb. There is a moment in this story that anyone who has ever burned a finger on a hot pan will instinctively understand. You are not thinking about destiny. You are not performing a ritual. You are simply reacting, the way every human being does, the way every child does on their first encounter with fire. You pull your hand back and you put your thumb in your mouth.
It lasts about 2 seconds. It barely registers as an event. And yet that single instinctive gesture, on a riverbank somewhere along the Boyne, changed the entire arc of Irish mythology. Before we get to the moment itself, we have to understand what the Salmon of Knowledge actually was. And the first complication is that in the oldest manuscript source, the Magni Martha Fionn, or Boyhood Deeds of Fionn, the fish is not actually called by that name. The phrase Broaden Feasa, often translated as Salmon of Knowledge, was attached to the creature by later tradition. The text itself simply describes a salmon associated with Feck's pool on the River Boyne, presumed by scholars to be the prophesied fish. The label arrived later. The fish was always stranger than any label could contain.
The story begins, as many Irish mythological stories do, not with a person, but with a place. Somewhere at the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds, there existed what was called the Well of Sagai's, a sacred source associated in the oldest traditions with wisdom, with poetic inspiration, with the kind of deep knowing that sits at the edge of the human and the divine. Around the well grew 9 hazel trees. Their nuts contained the concentrated essence of all knowledge in the world. And as autumn came each year, those nuts fell from the branches into the water below, and into the waiting mouth of the salmon that lived there. But in some of the oldest traditions, the salmon was not simply a fish that had eaten hazelnuts. It was something far stranger, the transformed body of Fintan Mac Bocra, the sole human survivor of the Great Flood. When the waters rose and all others drowned, God felt sorrow for Fintan and allowed him to become a salmon rather than drown with the world he had known. In that form he survived, and went on surviving century after century, drifting through the waters of the Well of Sagai's, absorbing what fell into them from the hazel trees above. The fish was not merely old. It was a human consciousness that had been swimming in a fish's body since before the memory of Ireland began, growing heavier and stranger and more freighted with knowing than any living thing had a right to be. The Boyhood Deeds describes the salmon growing older and heavier with the years, without naming what was behind that heaviness. In the Fintan tradition, the explanation is there. An ancient man, the oldest being alive, waiting in water. The mechanism of transfer was explicit in the tradition. Whoever was the first person to taste the flesh of that fish would receive everything it had absorbed, every nut from every hazel tree, every accumulation of the well's wisdom, passing from the salmon into a human being in a single moment of consumption. Enter Finnegas. He was a poet, which in the Celtic world meant something far more complex than the modern word suggests. The poets of early Ireland, the Fillid, occupied a role that blended scholar, historian, prophet, legal authority, and sacred professional. They were among the most educated and most feared people in society. Their praise could raise a man's reputation. Their satire could destroy it. And the thing that placed a poet at the highest level of their craft was not simply command of language or memory, but access to a particular kind of prophetic insight, a capacity for truth-telling that went beyond what ordinary eyes and ears could gather. Finnegas wanted the salmon because he wanted everything that came with it. He had settled himself beside Feck's pool in the River Boyne and been waiting there for 7 years, casting his line, watching the water, living in patient vigil beside a river he believed held his destiny. When the wandering young man who called himself Demne arrived at the pool and became Finnegas's student, it seemed from the outside like an ordinary apprenticeship. The Boyhood Deeds describes the arrangement straightforwardly. Demne studied, he served, he waited. And then, after all of Finnegas's 7 years of patient fishing, the day arrived. He caught the salmon. The instructions he gave his student were simple, and the emphasis on the second was everything. Cook it for me, and do not taste it. Finnegas was not careless. He knew exactly what the prophecy said, and he had spent 7 years engineering this moment so that he would be the first to taste. The instruction was a safeguard. What the accounts preserve from this point is a detail so domestic and so utterly ordinary that it has lodged itself in the imagination across centuries.
A blister formed on the skin of the salmon as it cooked over the fire. The boy, perhaps instinctively trying to keep the fish in good condition, pressed the blister down with his thumb to burst it. The fat was hot. His thumb burned. And without thinking, without choosing, without understanding what he was doing, he put his burned thumb into his mouth. In that moment, the knowledge of the entire world flooded into him. When Finnegas returned and looked at his student's face, something had changed there. He asked the direct question, had the boy eaten any of the fish? The boy told the truth. He had not eaten the fish, but he had burned his thumb, and he had put it in his mouth. Finnegas understood what this meant. The prophecy had not specified a poet. It had said the first person to taste the flesh would receive the wisdom. And the first person to taste the flesh of that salmon, through no intention and no design, through nothing more than a burned thumb and a natural reflex, had been a young man who had not been born when Finnegas first sat down beside the pool.
What Finnegans did next is one of the most quietly dignified moments in all of Irish mythology. He gave the boy the entire fish to eat, recognizing that the moment had already passed, and that the proper response was not bitterness, but acceptance. He also confirmed the name that had already found the young man once on a hurling field among boys who had no idea who he was. Not Demna, but Fionn, the bright one, the fair one. That name had been given to him by strangers who saw something in him they could not explain. Here at the edge of the Boyne, by the man who had spent 7 years preparing what would turn out to be someone else's inheritance, it was sealed. You can spend 7 years sitting beside a pool, doing everything right, and the knowledge will still choose to enter the world through a burned thumb. The ability that Fionn carried for the rest of his life was specific and repeatable. Whenever a question was put to him that required truth rather than guesswork, he would place his thumb against his tooth or suck his thumb, and the answer would come. The Acalum Nisenarach, one of the major medieval collections of Fenian stories, calls this the tooth of knowledge, using the Old Irish term det fis. In the same texts, the ritual gesture is connected to a specific poetic practice called the Tame Lida, and the presence of that term beyond the Fenian stories confirms something important. The 12th century Sanas Chormaich, an early Irish glossary compiled independently of the boyhood deeds tradition, lists Tame Lida as one of the 3 methods by which a poet could acquire prophetic knowledge. That the concept appears across 2 separate medieval sources in 2 distinct textual traditions suggests it was not simply a narrative device invented for the Fionn story, but a live category of professional poetic practice, something the culture around it recognized and gave a name to. This was not a parlor trick or a convenience. It was a sacred and professional capacity, a formal method by which certain initiated practitioners could access truth. What the story insists on is that the wisdom Fionn received was not the end of a process, but the beginning of a responsibility. He was connected, through the gesture of thumb to tooth, to an ongoing channel of truth he could summon when it was needed. The fish was gone, and with it, in the Fintan tradition, the consciousness of an ancient man released from millennia of waiting. But the connection remained, woven into Fionn's body in the most physical way imaginable. Not in his mind, not in his language, but in his hand, in the simple arc from finger to mouth that every human being makes when they have touched something hot. The mythological pattern was not unique to Ireland. In the Welsh tradition, a boy named Gwion Bach accidentally received transformative wisdom from the contents of a magical cauldron through an accidental taste without intending to claim what was not meant for him. In the Norse tradition, the hero Sigurd kills the dragon Fafnir and, while roasting the creature's heart, burns his finger and puts it to his lips. He is suddenly able to understand the speech of birds.
In 1930, the scholar Robert D. Scott examined all three traditions together in a comparative study whose title, The Thumb of Knowledge in Legends of Fionn, Sigurd, and Taliesin, captures precisely what runs through each of them. The same mechanism, the same accidental contact, the same instinctive gesture, the knowledge that was never meant for the one who receives it, arriving through the body rather than through the mind. The parallels are too exact to be coincidental and too widespread to be explained by borrowing between traditions. They point towards something very old, the conviction that wisdom of a certain order cannot be pursued directly, that it comes sideways, at a moment no one planned for, through the most ordinary reflex in the human repertoire. For Fionn, the moment at Feck's pool completed a transformation that was both inward and outward. Chapter 3. The Samhain Fire and the Spear's Cold Edge. He walked away from the Boyne with a name made certain, a burned thumb, and the accumulated wisdom of the world sitting somewhere inside him like a tide waiting to be called. Wisdom, however profound, does not automatically translate into standing. The outstanding question was what he would do with both. And the answer was waiting at Tara, on a Samhain night, in the form of a creature that had been burning Ireland's great hall to the ground for 23 consecutive years. To understand what it meant for Fionn to go to Tara, you have to understand what Tara was. It was not simply a place. It was the idea of Ireland made physical, the ceremonial and political center of the island. The hill where the High King held court, where the great assemblies were called, where the laws and the genealogies and the histories were recited and affirmed. The Hill of Tara in County Meath is a real place that you can visit today, a low, rounded rise above the surrounding farmland with views in every direction. But in the age of the Finian cycle, it was something much larger than its physical dimensions. It was the heart of the country. To be recognized there was to be recognized everywhere. To be dishonored there was to be destroyed. For 23 consecutive years, something had been dishonoring Tara in the most dramatic and destructive way imaginable. Every year, on the night of Samhain, the great threshold festival at the turning of the year, when the boundaries between the ordinary world and the supernatural world were believed to dissolve, a being from the Tuatha De Danann arrived. His name was Eilean, though the Magna Martha Finn calls the same antagonist by a different name entirely, Aed. Whether we are looking at variant names for one being or two separate traditions that converged on the same story, the creature is consistent in what it does. It came from the fairy mounds, from that ancient race of supernatural beings who had preceded the human inhabitants of Ireland and still occupied the otherworldly spaces beneath its hills and within its landscapes. It was, in the language of the sources, a fire-breather, a burner, a destroyer of places. But Eilean did not simply arrive and attack. What made him so devastating, and what made the 23 years of annual destruction so humiliating for the warriors of Tara, was the specific sequence of his method. Before the fire came the music. Eilean would appear on the night of Samhain and begin to play a stringed instrument. The old Irish sources use the word timpan, a term for some kind of plucked or struck stringed instrument, something in the range of what we might call a dulcimer or psaltery, though the exact nature of the instrument has been debated for centuries. The music it produced was not merely pleasant, it was supernatural. Anyone who heard it was pulled instantly into deep, helpless sleep. Every man in the hall at Tara, every warrior and guard and servant and king would fall where they stood. And once they were asleep, Eilean would breathe fire across the buildings and their contents, reducing the great hall to ash and ruin before disappearing back into the night. Think about the compound nature of this humiliation. The greatest warrior culture in Ireland could not defeat an enemy it could not stay awake to fight. The problem was not courage or strength or numbers. Tara had all of those in abundance. The problem was that the music bypassed courage entirely. It reached past every trained defense and every act of will and simply switched off consciousness. 23 years, 23 Samhains, 23 mornings of waking up among the ruins of what had been the centerpiece of Irish power, and no one had found a solution. The Acalam na Sonorach places what followed with a precision worth pausing on. Fionn was 10 years old when he arrived at Tara for that 24th Samhain. This is a remarkable claim to hold in mind, given everything we have seen of his wandering and his time on the Boyne. The sources carry a chronological tension here that they do not fully resolve. But the Acalam is specific, and the age gives the episode a different weight. This was not a seasoned young man at the height of his powers walking into a room of warriors. It was a child. The atmosphere of that gathering would have been saturated with 23 years of failure. The king asked his assembly a direct question. Who among them would stand guard against Eilean that night and protect Tara from destruction? The silence that followed was not the silence of cowardice. It was the silence of men who had heard that music and knew what it meant. Fionn stepped forward and made an offer, but he attached a condition to it. If he succeeded in protecting Tara, he wanted recognition of what was rightfully his, the leadership of the Fianna that had belonged to his father. What Fionn did not yet know, as he made that offer in the hall at Tara, was that someone in the gathering already knew exactly who he was, and had been waiting, perhaps for years, for precisely this moment. His name was Fiacca mac Cunhaill, and the sources give him a detail so specific it feels like something preserved from a genuine tradition, rather than invented by a later storyteller. Fiacca had once been one of Cumhaill's men. He had fought beside Fionn's father. He knew the face and the bearing of the bloodline, because he had once pledged himself to it. When Fionn made his offer, Fiacca recognized him. What Fiacca gave him was a spear, a weapon that would later be remembered by the specific name of birga, with qualities that went beyond the physical. Its crucial property was precise. When the weapon was unsheathed and the bare steel of the blade was touched against the forehead or against another part of the body, it counteracted the sleep-inducing power of Eilean's music. One variant tradition describes a more physically insistent version of this, Fionn keeping himself awake by pressing his skin against the point itself, the sharpness rather than the cold doing the work of holding the mind in the present. Either way, the principle was the same, a physical anchor calibrated exactly to the problem. Not a weapon of greater force than Eilean possessed, but a weapon that addressed the specific mechanism by which Eilean won without ever having to fight. There is something very much in keeping with Fionn's character, as we have seen it developing, in the fact that the solution to Eilean was not brute power, but understanding. The music worked by exploiting the gap between intention and unconsciousness, the moment when even the most determined warrior's will gave way before something it could not consciously resist. The spear closed that gap. The night of Samhain came, the fires were built, the halls were full, and somewhere out in the darkness beyond the walls of Tara, Eilean was making his way toward the hill, from whatever hollow or mound was his point of origin. Fionn stationed himself outside. He unsheathed the birga. He pressed the blade against his skin. And then the music began.
What follows in the oldest accounts is the simplest and most dramatic moment in the entire sequence. Every other man at Tara went down into sleep. The music moved through the hall and the yard and the outbuildings like a tide coming in, and all the trained warriors and guards and royal attendants were swallowed by it. Only Fionn remained standing, the metal of the spear insisting on his wakefulness, while everything around him collapsed into unconsciousness. Eilean arrived. He had come to burn, and for the first time in 23 Samhains, someone was awake and waiting for him. The details of the actual combat in the sources are brief. What the mythology chose to preserve was not the extended drama of a long battle, but the stark reversal of fortune.
A being that had operated for 23 years without ever having to face meaningful opposition was suddenly confronted with a situation it had no framework for. Fionn killed Eileen. He took the head as proof of the deed and displayed it when the hall woke with the morning, surrounded once again by buildings that were still standing. The political consequences were immediate and sweeping. The king recognized Fionn's heritage, recognized in the public and formal language that mattered in early Irish law and custom that this young man was the legitimate son of Cumhaill, and that the leadership of the Fianna was his by right of blood and deed combined. Command was transferred. And then came the moment that the mythology clearly regarded as one of its most charged and significant turning points. Gall Mac Morna stepped aside. Not unwillingly, the sources tell us. Gall became a loyal follower of Fionn. A dispute would eventually break out between the clans again. The specific quarrel, the sources record, was over the pig of Slanga, the old antagonism between Clan Basna and Clan Morna proving not permanently extinguishable. But at this moment, in the public forum of Tara after the first unburned Samhain in 23 years, Gall bent his knee. This is one of mythology's great symbolic acts of reconciliation, the kind that never quite resolves everything underneath it, but publicly marks the possibility of a new arrangement. The man who had killed the father yielded to the son. What came next was the formal working out of something left unfinished since the night of the Battle of Cnucha. Having secured his leadership, Fionn turned to the question of Eric, the compensation that Irish law required to be paid for a killing. This was not vengeance in the personal and bloody sense. It was a legal and social mechanism, a way of settling accounts that acknowledged harm while providing a path forward rather than an endless spiral of retribution. Fionn went to his maternal grandfather, Taj, the druid on the hill of Almu, the man whose refusal of Cumhaill had set everything in motion, and demanded compensation for his father's death. The threat he attached was the threat the law allowed: single combat or settlement.
The A Calamna Señorach adds a detail that thickens the texture of this moment. Preceding the Berga episode, the text notes that Cumhaill had earlier fathered a son by a woman named Alma, daughter of Brachan, who died in childbirth. Whether the hill of Almu already carried her name, or whether that name became part of what connected the estate to the women Cumhaill had loved, the claim Fionn was now pressing on Tag ran deeper than a simple legal settlement. Tag settled. What he surrendered was the estate of Almu itself, the present-day Hill of Allen in County Kildare, the very ancestral seat that the Druid's original prophecy had predicted he would lose if his daughter married. The wound, once more, had become the inheritance. The fear that had destroyed Fionn's family had generated the exact outcome it was meant to prevent. And the seat on the hill that Tag had sacrificed so much to protect passed to the grandson he had never acknowledged. Gall Mac Morna also paid his portion of Eric. The accounts were settled. The debts were registered and closed.
The three mottos of the Fianna, Glen ar Croy, Nert angeg, Bert derer ambriahar, purity of heart, strength of limb, action to match their word, were not abstract ideals. They were a code by which an institution had to live if it was going to function as Ireland's protectors against threats that ordinary armies could not address. Fionn, by slaying Eileen, had demonstrated all three simultaneously: the purity to face something supernatural without flinching, the physical endurance to withstand a force that had laid every other warrior flat, and the willingness to back a public offer with the actual deed. He had not promised to try, he had promised to succeed, and then he had gone out and succeeded. The wisdom he carried had arrived through a burned thumb and a reflex. And now the seat of his grandfather, the command of his father's warriors, and the loyalty of his father's killer had all converged in a single evening on a hill that would carry his story for 1,000 years.
But leading the Fianna was not simply a matter of having proved yourself worthy of the position. It meant entering a life of permanent obligation to the High King, to Ireland, to the men who now owed you their loyalty, and to the supernatural forces that the Fianna would constantly be called upon to face. In the years that followed, Fionn would hunt and fight and love and lose. He would grow into his authority and his complexity, becoming the figure around whom the entire Fenian cycle would eventually orbit. But all of that still lay ahead. The next great crisis he would face would not come from the fairy mounds. It would come from inside his own hall, on the night of his own wedding feast, when a young woman looked across the room at one of his most trusted warriors and made a choice that would send the Fianna chasing two lovers across every county of Ireland. Chapter 4. What Slipped Through His Fingers. The most devastating crisis in the history of the Fianna did not come from outside. It came from a wedding table. Fionn mac Cumhaill was aging when the High King Cormac mac Airt offered him his daughter Granny, and the banquet arranged to celebrate the match should have been a moment of triumph. What it was instead, as the evening deepened and Granny moved through the hall with a specific purpose, was the beginning of a pursuit that would last years, cross the length and breadth of Ireland, and end in a death that was technically accidental and almost certainly not. The sources are explicit about Fionn's age in a way that matters. He had already led the Fianna for years, had buried at least one wife, the dear woman Sob, whose disappearance into the enchantment of the druid Fir Doiric had cost him the woman he loved and left him raising Oisin alone. He was not the young man who had faced Ailinn at Tara. The offer of Granny was the offer that powerful aging men have always found appealing. A young woman who would restore some sense of continuation, of brightness, of something still ahead.
Diarmuid was one of Fionn's most trusted warriors, loyal, celebrated, and famously beautiful. He bore a love spot, in Irish a ball siavke, a mark on his forehead acquired through a supernatural encounter in his youth, whose effect was absolute. Any woman who saw it would immediately fall in love with him. Diarmuid, understanding the chaos this could cause, habitually kept it covered. But at the wedding feast, in the press and heat of a large gathering, the covering slipped, or the angle was wrong, and Grain saw it. The decision was made in an instant, against every political logic and every social bond the evening was supposed to be celebrating. What Grain did next is one of the most audacious acts in all of Irish mythology. She had drugged the wine. She had prepared for this. One by one, every man at the banquet, except a small number of selected warriors, slid into deep and artificial sleep. The Hall of Tara, which was supposed to be celebrating a marriage, became a room of unconscious guests, while Grain moved through it with a clarity of purpose that the sources present as simultaneously admirable and terrifying. She went first to Oisin and asked him to flee with her. He refused. She went then to Diarmuid and laid the same request before him. He also refused, and the refusal is worth noting because it is not the refusal of a man indifferent to her. It is the refusal of a man who knew exactly what accepting would cost and was trying, in the language of loyalty and honor, to hold the line. Fionn was his lord. Fionn was his friend. He said no. Grain then placed a gaze on him.
To understand why this changes everything, you need to understand what a geis was in early Irish culture. It was not simply a request or a wish or even a command. It was a binding magical obligation, something closer to a law written directly onto a person's fate. To violate a geis was not merely a social disgrace. It was understood as an invitation to catastrophe, a rupture in the fabric of a person's destiny that typically led to death or destruction. Diarmuid knew all of this. He knew what she had placed on him, and he left the feast with her, into the dark of an Irish night, away from everything he had built his adult life upon.
He was not cold about it. The accounts give us a Diarmaid who was sorrowful and reluctant, who understood that what he was doing to Fionn was an injury of the deepest kind. He had been compelled, yes, but the compulsion did not erase his understanding of what it meant. This is one of the reasons the story has endured so long and accumulated so many thousands of tellings across Ireland and Scotland. Diarmaid is not a villain who steals another man's bride out of selfishness or rivalry. He is a man caught between two claims upon him, the guise he cannot refuse, and the loyalty he cannot honorably abandon. And the tragedy is that both of those claims are real, and both have weight. The structure of what Grain set in motion places the story within recognizable company, both within Irish mythology and in the wider European tradition. Within Ireland itself, the nearest parallel is the Deirdre story from the Ulster cycle, Longes mac Nuislan, the exile of the sons of Uisnech, in which a young woman refuses an aging ruler in favor of a younger man. A long pursuit follows, and the lover's flight ends in tragedy and death. That the same essential pattern appears in both major cycles of Irish mythology suggests it was not simply a single story, but a recurring cultural template, a way of exploring the collision between arranged power and individual desire that the tradition returned to more than once because it never fully settled the tension. Scholars have also traced close structural connections to the Tristan and Iseult legend. The parallel developed most thoroughly in comparative work on the sources of the medieval romance. Both stories center on a young woman drawn to a man in place of marrying an aging king. Both are organized around flight across a landscape and concealment in forests. Both hinge on a supernatural mechanism, a love potion in one case, a love spot in the other, that makes the central desire simultaneously involuntary and absolute. What distinguishes the Irish tradition is what it did with the woman at the center. Grain planned the drugging of the wine. She chose her man and took deliberate steps to bind him to her. The compulsion that governed her own feelings arrived through sight and cannot be separated from the Bal Saorsa, but she did not wait for rescue or permission. Where Iseult was swept into her story by what was done to her, Grain stepped into hers by what she did.
Fionn woke. What followed was one of the longest, most geographically extensive pursuits in the entire mythological tradition of Ireland. The lovers moved across the whole country, through forests and mountains and hidden caves and river crossings, with Fionn and the Fianna pressing behind them through every terrain. The pursuit was deeply personal. These were Fionn's own men chasing one of their own, and many of the Fianna were sympathetic to Diarmaid, who had been a comrade and a friend. Into this tension stepped the one figure powerful enough to offer meaningful shelter, Angus, the god of love and Diarmaid's foster father, who used his otherworldly resources to obscure the lover's trail and provide cover in the most dangerous moments. Across Ireland, the landscape absorbed the story. Megalithic structures, the ancient stone monuments that dot the Irish countryside, the great flat-top dolmens and passage tombs that predate the Celts by millennia, were drawn into the narrative. People began calling them Leba Diarmada Acheshrena, the bed of Diarmaid and Graina. The places where the lovers slept, the hillsides where they hid, the river crossings they used to cover their trail. The living memory of the story attached itself to the actual land and became part of how the land was understood. You could walk across Ireland and follow them, stone monument to stone monument, the geography of a love story laid over the geography of the island itself.
The years of flight were not entirely without their strange textures. One episode from the tradition captures an odd domesticity that could settle into even the most desperate pursuit. Grain, craving berries from a rowan tree guarded by a one-eyed giant named Sirbon, a creature in the service of the Tuatha De Danann who permitted no one to take the fruit, sent Diarmaid to face him. Diarmaid killed the giant and brought the berries back. Then Fionn and his men arrived, and, not yet knowing the lovers were hidden above, settled beneath the same tree. Fionn began a game of chess against Oisin directly below where Diarmuid was concealed in the branches. Unable to resist the game below him, Diarmuid secretly signaled to Oisin which moves to make, helping Fionn's own son defeat Fionn from 30 feet overhead, invisible and undetected, while being hunted by the man he was beating. Eventually, through the intercession of Angus and Grain's own initiative, the pursuit came to an end. The accounts make clear that the settlement was not simply granted by an exhausted Fionn, it was engineered. Grain persuaded Diarmuid to invite Fionn and the Fianna to a feast, making herself the active architect of the reconciliation rather than a passive recipient of Fionn's magnanimity. A genuine settlement was reached, and the couple settled at Case Coran in County Sligo, where they raised 5 children and lived for years in what the sources describe as real domestic peace. The storm had passed. The crisis of the wedding night had been formally closed. And then Fionn invited Diarmuid hunting.
The boar hunt was held at Bin Hulben, the mountain known today as Ben Bulben in County Sligo, which rises dramatically from the flat plain around it, a plateau-topped mass with sheer cliff faces that makes it look carved rather than grown. In the most common telling, Diarmuid went without his greatest weapons, the sword and spear most closely associated with him, taking only lesser arms. This detail has the feel of something significant, a man who no longer believed he needed his full armor, who trusted the peace that had been made. Or perhaps a man who, on some level, already sensed what was coming and had made a private decision about how he would meet it. An old prophecy had long attached itself to Diarmuid, that he would be killed by a great boar. He had always known this. The hunt, whether Fionn designed it to bring this outcome about, or simply arranged it in a place where the outcome was waiting, led exactly where the prophecy had promised. The boar gored Diarmuid, and the wound was mortal. What happened next is the moment the story has always been waiting to deliver. Water drunk from Fionn's cupped hands had the power of healing, a specific personal gift for restoration carried in his hands and the water they held. Diarmuid was dying on the slope of Bin Hulben, and the only thing that could save him was for Fionn to walk to a water source, cup his hands, and carry the water back without letting it spill. Fionn walked to the water. He cupped his hands. He turned back toward Diarmuid. And then, as if remembering something, as if some other thought had pushed itself to the front of his mind, he opened his fingers. The water ran through. He went back to the water. He tried again. The same thing happened.
It was Finn's grandson Oscar who finally broke the silence around what was happening, young enough or honest enough to say in public what everyone watching could see. He shamed Finn. He named what was happening. Under that pressure, Finn went back to the water a 3rd time and carried it toward Diarmuid with cupped hands. It was too late. Diarmuid had died. Whether this constitutes a calculated act or an unconscious hesitation or something in between, a grief old enough to have calcified into something indistinguishable from purpose, the mythology does not settle. It leaves it suspended, which is part of why the story still disturbs. We have all watched someone take a little too long to do a necessary thing and wondered, quietly, what was really happening in the pause.
The story does not end on the mountainside, though the versions disagree sharply about what follows. In some, Grain mourned Diarmuid with a grief that lasted until her own death. The woman who had overturned the world for love left finally alone in it. In others, something stranger and more unsettling occurred. Fionn, whose jealousy had survived the years of pursuit and the formal reconciliation both, directed his attention toward the widow. The Irish tradition records that in some versions, Grain eventually came to terms with Fionn, and that these terms went further than peace. She married him, the man she had fled on her wedding night, the man whose hands had held the water that might have saved Diarmuid. Whether this represents pragmatic survival in a world that left her few options, or something darker in how the tradition understood the relationship between grief and power, the mythology offers no verdict. The Fianna, by report, were openly contemptuous. They called after Grain as she departed with Fionn, in mockery or in grief. The accounts do not clearly distinguish. The woman who set the longest chase in Irish mythology in motion ended, in at least some versions of her story, in the arms of the man she had first refused.
What that makes of Fionn, the man who had received the wisdom of the salmon and built the Fianna into something unprecedented, is a question the tradition refuses to answer simply. He had been forged in loss, had built everything he stood on through intelligence and patience and genuine courage. But he had also, at the end of a story that began with love and loyalty and the most famous elopement in Irish mythology, revealed the shadow side of that same will. Whether that makes him a lesser hero or a more human one is a question Irish storytellers have been turning over for more than 1,000 years. The tradition answered it not with resolution, but with one more story, the strangest and most playful tale attached to his name, set not on a mountain in Sligo, but on a coastline in Antrim, where the ground itself is shaped like someone built something and walked away.
Chapter 5. Cunning in the Columns.
The most internationally recognized story attached to Fionn mac Cumhaill is the one least rooted in the ancient literary tradition that produced the rest of his mythology. That is the first and most surprising thing about it. 4 chapters of this series have followed a hero through the ancient manuscripts, through the boyhood deeds of Fionn, through the great medieval collections, through a tradition of storytelling that stretches back well over 1,000 years in written form, and further still in oral circulation. And now, at the last, we arrive at the story that more people around the world can actually tell, the one about the giant who built a road across the sea to fight a Scotsman, panicked when he saw how big his enemy was, and got dressed as a baby. This is the Giant's Causeway legend. The story belongs to popular folklore rather than to the elite literary Fenian cycle. The causeway, as Fionn's construction, does not appear in the great medieval manuscripts. The earliest written records connecting Fionn specifically to the basalt columns of Antrim date only to the 19th century. One reference point is an 1830 poem. The site was understood as supernatural in origin long before that, however. The oldest Irish name for the causeway is Clochan an Eifer, while a second name, Clochan of Homerach, means the stepping stones of the Fomerai, invoking that ancient race of supernatural beings who preceded even the Tuatha Dé Danann in Irish tradition. But the Fionn version, as we know it, is considerably younger than the warrior who earned his wisdom beside the Boyne. What happened, as W.B. Yeats observed in his 1888 collection, Fairy and Folk Tales of the Irish Peasantry, the same anthology in which the poet who would later shape the literary revival of Fionn's mythology paused to map how that mythology had already been transforming, is a process visible across many mythological traditions. The old pagan gods of Ireland grew smaller and smaller in the popular imagination over time, eventually becoming the fairies, while the pagan heroes grew bigger and bigger until they became giants. Fionn, in his literary form, was never a giant. He was an exceptionally gifted man, a warrior and sage of the First Order, possessed of supernatural wisdom, capable of feats far beyond what ordinary men could achieve, but emphatically human in scale. The great 12th century collection of Fenian stories portrays him as a culture hero who debates St. Patrick and recounts his hunts across Ireland. There is no road-building giant anywhere in those texts. What emerged in popular memory over centuries of oral transmission was something more immediately comprehensible, a figure large enough to have shaped the physical landscape itself, whose quarrels with Scottish rivals explained why the North Antrim coast looks the way it does. This transformation is not a corruption of the tradition. The folk giant of the Giant's Causeway story is defined by the same essential quality that marks him throughout,
It simply expresses itself in a context that involves baby clothes and iron griddle cakes.
The story goes like this. Fionn mac Cumhaill, in popular tradition depicted as the largest and strongest giant in Ireland, constructs the Giant's Causeway, those approximately 40,000 interlocking hexagonal basalt columns that descend from the cliffs of County Antrim into the North Channel, as a pathway to reach a Scottish giant named Benandonor, sometimes called the Red Man. The challenge has been issued across the water, and the construction of the causeway is Fionn's answer to the problem of the sea between them. He tears up the Antrim coastline and fires chunks of rock into the water, building as he goes. When Fionn finally crosses and gets a look at Benandonor, he realizes he has badly miscalculated. The Scottish giant is not merely large, he is vast, in a category of scale that makes Fionn reconsider the entire enterprise on the spot. He retreats back to Ireland as fast as his enormous feet will carry him. In his haste, he loses a boot on the causeway, and the impression of that boot, preserved in the basalt columns of the site, is today one of the named features that visitors are shown. The Giant's Boot, a small but entirely tangible monument to the moment Fionn decided that retreat was the better part of valor.
Once home, Fionn turns to his wife, whose name in most Irish tellings is Una. Readers who have just come from the preceding chapter will recognize that Una is a figure distinct from Sab, the dear wife of the literary Fionn tradition. Una belongs specifically to the popular causeway story and the folk world that grew up around it. She devises the plan. She wraps her husband in sheets and places him in a large cradle, transforming the most feared warrior in Ireland into a credible infant. She bakes a batch of griddle bread, hiding iron griddles inside some of the loaves. When Benandonor crosses the causeway and arrives at the door demanding to know where Fionn is, Una tells him calmly that Fionn is out but will return shortly. She welcomes the Scottish giant inside and offers hospitality in the form of the griddle bread. He bites into one of the loaded loaves and chips his teeth on the iron hidden within. Una scolds him with the perfectly calibrated condescension of someone establishing a fictional standard. Her husband eats those without the slightest difficulty. She then feeds the baby in the cradle one of the plain loaves. The baby, who is Fionn, eats it without trouble.
Benandonor looks at the cradle. He has already broken his teeth on what the household apparently considers ordinary breakfast. The child in front of him is enormous, untroubled, and visibly capable of handling what just ruined his molars. He begins revising his mental image of what Fionn mac Cumhaill must actually be like if this is his infant son. Una then invites Benandonor to feel how sharp the baby's teeth are by putting his fingers into its mouth. Fionn bites down on the Scottish giant's little finger with what the story implies is considerable enthusiasm. This is the final evidence Benandonor needs. He flees back across the causeway, destroying it behind him as he goes, so that whatever enormous being fathered a child like that cannot follow him home. What remains on both sides of the North Channel are the broken ends of what was built. The columns at Antrim on the Irish side, and the matching basalt formations at Fingal's Cave on the Scottish island of Staffa. The myth was answering a real question. The columns look built. Human beings confronted with something that looks built will look for the builder, and giants are easier to grasp than plate tectonics.
Geologically, the site is extraordinary enough on its own terms. Around 50 to 60 million years ago, highly fluid molten basalt erupted through chalk beds across what is now County Antrim, forming an extensive volcanic plateau. As the lava cooled, it contracted and fractured, cracking downward as the mass cooled, producing the columnar structures. The hexagonal shape dominates because it distributes stress most efficiently. Nature, under pressure, preferring the geometry that minimizes tension. The tallest columns reach about 12 meters in height, and the solidified lava behind them is in places nearly 30 meters thick.
The named formations that visitors move through, the giant's organ, the giant's harp, the giant's gate, extend the myth into the landscape at every turn, and the giant's boot marks where Finn's flight became part of the stone. The site received UNESCO World Heritage status in 1986 and draws more than 1 million visitors a year. Before geology provided the explanation, art provided the audience. In 1739, a Dublin painter named Susanna Drury made 2 watercolor views of the causeway, the first significant artistic documentation of the site, and won the inaugural prize ever awarded by the Royal Dublin Society the following year. Engravings after her paintings were published in 1743 and had traveled far enough by 1765 to appear in the French Encyclopedia, where the columns were reproduced and examined by the continental scientific community. The causeway entered international consciousness through Drury's eye before it entered it through any geological survey, which means the myth and the art were doing the work of carrying the site across Europe while the theoretical vocabulary to explain it was still being assembled.
The landscape mythology does not stop at the causeway itself. In the broader popular tradition, Fionn is credited with creating the Isle of Man by scooping up a piece of Ireland and hurling it at a rival. The chunk missed its target and landed in the Irish Sea, and the void it left behind filled with water to become Lough Neagh, the largest lake in the British Isles. In Ayrshire, the offshore island of Ailsa Craig is identified in local tradition as another rock flung across the water during one of these territorial disputes. The Isle of Man also preserves its own independent version of the causeway story, one with a distinct antagonist and a distinct geography. In the Manx Gaelic tradition, Fionn's opponent is not Benadonor, but a creature called a Buggan. Their confrontation produces its own landscape marks. At Kirkchrist Rushen, Fionn's footsteps are said to have carved channels between the Calf of Man and the smaller island of Ketterland. When Fionn fled, the Buggan pulled out its own tooth and hurled it after him. The tooth fell into the sea and became the Chicken Rock, a reef that still bears that name in Manx waters today. The Manx tradition is the geographically closest parallel to the Irish story, showing how the same essential logic, a giant's flight leaving permanent marks in the landscape, was adapted independently to a different set of islands and a different local antagonist.
The connection to Scotland runs not only through the Causeway legend, but through James Macpherson's 18th-century poem cycle called Ossian, in which Fionn mac Cumhaill was transformed into a character named Fingal. The physical link between Scotland and Ireland that the story describes was always real, and the natural formation on Staffa entered documented history through Sir Joseph Banks' 1772 scientific visit, the first detailed written account of those Scottish hexagonal columns, providing the same kind of earliest written record anchoring for the Staffa formations that the 1830 poem provides for the Irish side. Macpherson claimed to have translated ancient Scottish Gaelic poetry. The authenticity of those claims is now generally doubted. Yet the poems endured, and the character of Fingal gave his name to the sea cave on Staffa, whose basalt columns were already there, waiting, matching perfectly the formations on the Irish side of the water. The name Fingal's Cave stuck. The myth had crossed the sea and attached itself to the landscape it described. In Newfoundland and parts of Nova Scotia, the name travels further still. To speak of Fingal, as his name is pronounced in English in those communities, distinct from Fionn mac Cumhaill in Newfoundland Irish, is sometimes used as a stand-in for Newfoundland or its culture more broadly. The phrase Fingal's Rising carried his name as a specifically Irish and specifically resilient rallying point for communities who brought the tradition with them across the Atlantic and kept it alive in bars and songs for generations.
According to the most widely held folk belief about his fate, Fionn mac Cumhaill is not dead, he sleeps. Somewhere beneath Ireland, different tellings place the location differently, but beneath Dublin is one common setting. He lies surrounded by the Fianna, not destroyed, but suspended, waiting. When Ireland reaches the hour of its greatest need, the Dord Fionn will be sounded 3 times, and he will rise. The same mythological pattern appears in the traditions of King Arthur in Britain and Charlemagne in continental Europe. But Ireland's version places the mechanism of waking in the sound of a horn and the promise in the certainty of return. James Joyce appears to have embedded the name itself as a double meaning in the title Finnegan's Wake. Finn again is awake, invoking that same tradition. The name Fionn today is given to children across Ireland, Scotland, and the Irish diaspora. In 2025, the Royal Mail issued a series of 8 stamps on British and Irish folklore, designed by the London-based artist Adam Simpson. Fionn appears building his causeway alongside the Loch Ness Monster, Cornish Piskies, Beowulf and Grendel, Blodeuwedd, Black Shuck, Selkies, and a Grindelow, a portrait essentially of the shared mythological heritage of the islands. The Dropkick Murphys, a Boston-based Irish-American punk band, recorded The Legend of Finn Cumhaill on their album Sing Loud, Sing Proud, giving his name a velocity it carries well. In the Japanese video game Fate Grand Order, he appears as an A-tier Lancer-class servant alongside legendary warriors from across world mythology. He features also in Shin Megami Tensei 5. The hill where he built his stronghold at Almu still carries his trace in the landscape. The cave beneath Dublin waits.
The question the story is really asking is the same one that has run through every chapter of this hero's mythology. From the burned thumb at the Boyne to the cold ire of the Burga held to the forehead to keep the mind awake when Ailin's music came to the cupped hands on the slope of Ben Bulben. When the thing you face is bigger than you are, what do you reach for? And Fionn's answer, across more than 1,000 years of storytelling in 4 languages on 2 islands and a diaspora that spread his name as far as Newfoundland, has always been the same. Not strength, not size, something older, something that arrived through a moment of ordinary pain beside a river, something woven into a thumb and a tooth. The horn has not been blowing yet, but in the stories people still tell to children growing up in Ireland, on cold evenings with the rain coming in off the Atlantic and the hexagonal columns of Antrim standing patient in the dark, the cave is always there, and the sleeper is always listening.
Fionn mac Cumhaill's story endures not because it celebrates invincibility, but because it refuses it. He was a hunted child who became a wise leader, a man who received the world's knowledge through an accidental burn, who defeated supernatural fire with cold iron and patient intelligence, and who still, at the height of his power, let water slip through his fingers. That contradiction is the point. His mythology spans ancient manuscripts and punk albums, medieval manuscripts and video games, the basalt columns of Antrim, and a sleeping cave beneath Dublin. It has survived because it keeps asking the same uncomfortable question. When what you face is greater than you are, what do you reach for? Every culture eventually produces its version of that question. Ireland produced Fionn. The answer he carries, not strength, but something woven into an ordinary moment of pain, may be the most honest one mythology has ever offered. Thank you for listening.